Hi, I'm Natalie Zen from Zen Dialogue. Welcome to this self-paced course on making data collection meaningful, offered by the Spur Change program. This is Module 2 on gender-sensitive and feminist approaches to data collection, and I want to acknowledge Salanga and especially Paula Richardson for contributing a lot of the content and thought that went into this module. If you participated in Module 1, you'll find that in this module, we add in another layer to think about when you're planning for your data collection. I'll take you through some of the characteristics of gender-sensitive and of feminist approaches to data collection. I'll present 5 key principles of feminist monitoring, evaluation, and learning. I'll give you a couple of examples of what that can look like. And then I'll invite you into an exercise that will bring you into some of the finer points and more detailed considerations to take into account as you're planning for your data collection from a gender-sensitive or feminist perspective. Before we start, please take a moment, pause the recording, and grab a piece of paper and pen, because we'll have a moment of reflection, and if you're engaging actively in the learning, it's going to be a lot more meaningful for you. All right, let's begin. So the backdrop for this module is that Canada's Feminist International Assistance Policy, or the FIAP, developed by Global Affairs Canada, or GAC, it states that no less than 95% of GAC's bilateral international assistance initiatives will target or will integrate gender equality and empowerment of women and girls. So we're publicly saying that gender equality is important and that it will have a significant impact on international development programming and how it's developed. Also, if you submit a proposal to GAC, it will be looking at the extent to which your program monitoring and evaluation data is going to be sex disaggregated and gender sensitive. And it will also be looking for your reporting to look at progress toward gender equality outcomes. So given that, here are my 2 questions for you. First, what does it mean to take a gender-sensitive approach to data collection? And what does it mean to take a feminist approach to data collection? So I invite you to grab that piece of paper and pen and take a couple of minutes, pause this recording, take a couple of minutes and reflect on those questions and jot down your ideas. And I'll meet you on the other side of that. And so before we get into defining gender-sensitive and feminist approaches to data collection, I think it's really helpful to see this as not a polarity or a binary, but it's more like a scale or a spectrum. So you can have gender harmful data collection that actually reinforces harmful gender norms and roles, practices, power relationships. You can have gender neutral data collection that actually ignores those things. Then you get into gender sensitive, where there is an acknowledgement that those gender norms and practices and power relationships exist, and it tracks them and documents them. Then gender specific data collection would accommodate those norms. So look at, what are the existing gender roles and support people in carrying out those roles better. And then finally, on the other end of the spectrum, you've got gender transformative data collection that actually challenges those norms and practices and relationships. And that's what I would call feminist, a feminist approach. So let's get into a bit more detail on those differences. And I think it's also important to say, again, this is not a polarity. It's more like, the feminist approach includes a lot of the characteristics of the gender-sensitive approach, and it transcends them and goes beyond. So the focus, as I said, in the gender-sensitive approach is to record and map those gender-based practices, norms, and stereotypes, and to track changes in those things over time. The feminist approach will do that, but it will actually explicitly challenge those unequal power relationships and roles, and will aim to strategically impact women's lives through the data collection process. In terms of analysis, a gender-sensitive approach will tend to disaggregate the data and do the analysis along the binary of men and women, boys and girls. The feminist approach will look at those things, the sex and gender identity, but will add in other elements of identity that can really impact on the extent to which a person is marginalized or discriminated against, such as their age, their ethnicity, their ability, or income. And it will look at how the intersection of those elements can come together, how those elements come together to impact a person's position and the extent to which they're marginalized in society. There's also the whole emerging field around going beyond the binary of sex and gender identity and doing data collection in a way that allows people to self-identify if that's relevant, or that asks questions that are perhaps more specific and more relevant to this particular inquiry than whether they identify as men or women. And this is an emerging field of study. There's a bit of literature you'll find in our references around this. Then, in terms of assumptions, a gender-sensitive approach will tend to assume that all women want what men want, that gender equality means that women have the same things that men have. Whereas a feminist approach is going to put more emphasis on actually hearing the voice of women and marginalized people, and listening to what they see as progress, and allowing that progress may not look like having the same things as men. A gender-sensitive approach to data collection will provide a framework on how to collect gender-related data. A feminist approach will do that too, but will put more emphasis on building in participatory methods into the data collection, attending a lot to the quality of the process, and going beyond just going in and extracting data from the stakeholders, but actually involving them in a meaningful process of gathering information from the environment and getting feedback on the extent to which the program is actually making a difference in the system. In terms of end result, a gender-sensitive approach will focus on accountability to donors and reporting to those donors and supporting their learning in terms of how to improve the next round of funding or how to improve their relationships with their grantees. A feminist approach will go beyond that and also emphasize accountability to the project participants, target populations, and partners, ensuring that the results of the data collection gets shared with those people and that it contributes to a social learning process around what change is happening and how to act in a way that's more effective, or how to adjust and navigate the project to achieve the desired change in the system. So let's go a bit deeper into key principles around that feminist approach to monitoring, evaluation, and learning. And I want to introduce a caveat around all of this, that there isn't a consensus. This is really an alive field of inquiry. And this is our take on things based on the literature that we've read. But there are different views on gender sensitive versus feminist. And there's a lot of discussion we could be having about this. Having said that, here are our 5 key principles. The first is that a feminist approach reframes the role of the evaluator. And so it acknowledges that evaluation is a political activity that takes place in political contexts. And it can lead to negative or positive effects on the evaluation stakeholders. It also really acknowledges that evaluators bring who they are into the process. And so there's an emphasis on explicitly acknowledging the attitudes, values, biases, and power that we're bringing into the exercise. And some organizations like Oxfam, Inter Pares, Plan are now building in personal and team and organizational reflections before the data collection process to get really explicit about who we are and what we're bringing in, and kind of exploding the notion of the evaluator as an objective, neutral expert who goes in and just gathers information from the field. Instead, the evaluator is more of a facilitator working with the project stakeholders so that they are actively involved in gathering that information on how the project's going. The evaluator becomes a co-learner and an ally in that change process. And so that goes together with the second principle, which is around a shift in power to the participants, where they have more control over the process and they actually become not just research subjects, but they become involved as researchers, and they may actually take a lead or have a role in defining research questions, in actually going out and collecting the data, and in analyzing and making sense of that data, learning from it and using it. And so that entails a whole other kind of emphasis on building local capacity for evaluation and for research, building that into the evaluation process and putting a lot of emphasis and resources into that capacity building element. And so that goes together with this third principle, where evaluation is really about not just measuring change, but in and of itself, the data collection can bring about change. And so there's an emphasis both in the process and in the findings around making the evaluation an aid in the change process. You know, what you measure is what you act on. And so the data collection process becomes an inherent part of the project as an initiative to intervene in a system and address certain challenges and move the needle on things. So evaluation becomes a kind of activism. It becomes part of that move towards increased social justice for women and marginalized people. And a lot of it is about giving voice and ensuring that the unheard voices actually get heard. And so the end product it's not just about producing a nice report that might get shelved, but it's really about the process. The process is an intrinsic part of the product, and the product needs to be used, by the stakeholders involved in the project and in the change process. Another key principle is around being inclusive and intersectional. And here what we mean is valuing different ways of knowing and learning. So going beyond the rational and the objective, and also inquiring about emotion, experience, and intuition, and seeing those as valid and legitimate sources of knowledge. And so women and other marginalized people become, they are viewed as legitimate knowledge holders. And it's really important to include those diverse voices and promote a collective reflection among all of the stakeholders, including those, with more power in the system and those who are on the margins. Finally, there's a recognition in a feminist approach that change doesn't necessarily happen in a linear or in an incremental way. Instead, it can be disruptive, and also particularly when we're talking about gender equality and other forms of movement towards social justice, there can be backlashes and reversals and retrogression. And so it's important that our evaluation tools and methods be flexible enough to capture the change that actually is happening, even if it's not what we were hoping for, even if it's not in the direction we were hoping for. So here on the slide, you've got a few examples of those more flexible tools and methods that can complement some of the more traditional methods that we talked about in Module 1 and also in the baseline microlearning. And there's also a handout we're providing in Module 3 that describes these and some other tools and methods and goes into them in more detail. So some examples of what this can look like. One example is from Oxfam, and it's with their Engendering Change program. This was a program with 44 partner organizations of different sizes, budgets, missions. There were women's and feminist organizations and networks, membership organizations, mixed NGOs, co-ops, you name it. And the project was about supporting them to become more gender just. And so the monitoring and evaluation challenge in this project was doing something that would be meaningful to such different organizations and that would allow them to self-reflect and self-evaluate on, starting from where they were, very different points, and defining what progress toward gender justice means in their particular case. And at the same time, finding a way to gather information on how the project was doing and what progress was being made. So what they did was they developed an organizational capacity assessment tool. And this was something that allowed each organization to define its own measures of success, its own criteria, but then also they were asked to define a numerical scale. And what that allowed was meaningful periodic self-reflection by each organization, but also the capacity to aggregate the data across the different organizations and find trends and comparisons across different types of organizations and different regions. They were working in 3 different continents, 4 different regions. So this was a really interesting way for them to find that balance of really meaningful and participatory approaches and also capturing and being able to aggregate the results of the project. Another example is also from Oxfam, and it was with their gender mainstreaming and leadership trajectory. This was what they decided to do as a complement to some more traditional approaches was to adopt the most significant change methodology. And so they trained 20 organizations and 12 gender consultants in 12 countries in this methodology. And what it involved was gathering stories of change as a result of the project from the field, and then having those stories read and assessed by a panel of stakeholders who then would decide which of the stories represented the most significant change achieved by the project. So you can see that that would involve a really interesting process of social learning where there's a discussion by the different stakeholders and there's learning going on throughout the duration of the project that allows them to take back that feedback and adjust their management and implementation of the project. A third example is from my colleague Françoise Coupal. She has carried this out in a number of different evaluations, and it's a complement to other more traditional methods. What she'll do is gather key stakeholders together for a 4-hour workshop, and she'll invite the stakeholders first to identify key results from their perspective of the project, and then she'll use a method called World Cafe. And what that looks like is 4 different tables with 4 different discussion topics, and that'll depend on the focus of the evaluation, but it might be strengths and weaknesses, learnings and recommendations, sustainability, partnership, whatever. And 5 or 6 participants will go to each of the tables, and they'll discuss that topic and jot down their key ideas on flip chart for about 20 minutes. And then they will rotate to each of the different tables for another 20 minutes each and add their ideas to the flip chart. So in a very short amount of time, a lot of information is gathered for the evaluation. At the same time, the stakeholders are involved in an exchange and a collective learning process around how the project's going that they can take into their future practice and collaborations, and that helps them to do the work better. And they get to be heard. So that feels good for them, and it's also super valuable for the evaluation. So it's really a win-win-win situation. And so now I want to invite you to apply some of these ideas to your own next data collection exercise. And if you don't have one, you can use our case study. We've provided a handout number 1 from module 1. If you're working with the case study, the invitation is to imagine that the implementing organizations want to carry out a midterm data collection exercise to support the project. And the focus of that exercise is to collect data around the project indicators, create a collaborative learning opportunity around the challenges that the project aims to address, and also help target populations to share their experience with the project so far. So you're part of a gender equality and evaluation team hired to support the organizations in designing their midterm data collection. And so your job is bringing in the gender sensitive and feminist lens. So whether you're working on your own data collection exercise or the case study, step 1 is to think about, from that gender sensitive or feminist lens, what are your recommendations on the questions below? So my invitation is take even just 5 or 10 minutes, use worksheet number 2, and answer at least one of the following 4 questions. The first one is, from that gender sensitive or feminist perspective, who should be collecting the data and what characteristics or capacities or training should those data collectors have? 2, what types of questions or key themes should be focused on during data collection from that gender and feminist lens? 3, what are some key considerations and strategies to think about when collecting the data? And here you might think about logistics in terms of how to get people participating and what some of the obstacles might be for different populations to participate in the data collection process and how you might overcome those obstacles. Number 4 is, what are some key considerations and strategies when you're planning for the analysis, sharing, and use of the data from that gender-sensitive or feminist approach? So your first step is just to jot down your own ideas based on what I've shared here. And then step 2, really important to do these as 2 separate steps. Take worksheet number 3, the data collection design checklist, and look through it against your responses and see to what extent did you take into account the considerations listed in the checklist, or does it give you any new ideas that you want to capture? So have fun with it. And this checklist really adds a whole other layer of learning, and I think it will be a really valuable tool for you in planning your own work. So enjoy, and may it be useful to you. See you in Module 3.